Hello, I'm Michael Brown, President of the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to our sixth and final Creative Thought Forum webinar as part of the 2022 series, Seeking Justice Toward a More Equitable America. The series has explored themes of social justice from multiple perspectives. We're grateful to the following Creative Thought Forum series sponsors for their support. The National Endowment for the Humanities. NEH has asked me to say the following, that any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this event do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Also want to thank Patricia G. Foshi for the Stewart Hall Charitable Fund, the Paulo Hemo Foundation, Thornburg Investment Management, the Luke and Betty Bortman Endowment Fund, the Flora Crichton Lecture Fund, and members of SAR's Founder Society. Events like these are made possible by the generous support of our donors and members. If you'd like more information on becoming an SAR member, please visit our website at sarweb.org. We also appreciate your voluntary donations for this event. You should also know that this and the previous 5 webinars are available on YouTube at SAR's YouTube channel. Today's moderator is the anthropologist, historian, and cultural consultant, as well as native son of New Mexico, Dr. Estevan Rael-Gálvez. He served as the former Senior Vice President of Historic Sites at the National Trust for Historic Preservation, Executive Director of the National Hispanic Cultural Center, and the State Historian of New Mexico. Dr. Rael-Gálvez currently serves on the Board of Directors of SAR and is CEO of Creative Strategies 360 Degrees, a consulting firm that supports transformative work within communities and organizations. He's also director of the Mellon Foundation funded project, Native Bound, Unbound, Archive of the Indigenous Enslaved, a website that will be hosted here at SAR, and you should come back to look at it because it's really going to be interesting and important. So I'm going to do the handoff to Estevan, and he will take it from there. Estevan, it's all yours.
Bupuwawe, buenas tardes, good afternoon. Thank you so much, Michael, and to SAR, the NEH for this work, and for welcoming us to Ogepoge. My name is Estevan Rael-Gálvez. I'm deeply honored to be here this afternoon to paraphrase the series Seeking Justice by illuminating the creative thinking and work done and that remains to be done as we navigate both through the past and the present. It is true that these conversations have become painfully contentious over the past decade, not more, though the shadows cast by steel, stone, and bronze monuments in public spaces has been a source of pain since they rose up. And while we are living through a reckoning, it is important to remember it's not the first time. We have been here before. And if the events of the past several years or months or in the past few weeks are any indication, this is ongoing work for historians, artists, and everyday people who create community somewhere in between remembering and forgetting. And although James Baldwin reminds us that the past is never past, but literally present in everything that we do, our gathering today is about creative thinking and doing that help us recognize a more complex and just world. I'm so excited, actually, and honored to share the space today with these 2 deeply thoughtful and creative individuals, both of whom have devoted their work to raising our consciousness. I necessarily will cut my introductions of these individuals short only in the interest of time, and place their bios in the chat. I'm going to introduce both, and then I'll turn it over to one of them. Dr. Kaitlin M. Murphy has devoted her life to active movement. As a dancer, a visual artist, and a thinker, and a global consultant grounding memory and activism. She received her PhD in Performance Studies and MA in Visual Culture from NYU. She's a professor of social, cultural, and critical theory and culture and Politics at the University of Arizona, and the author of Mapping Memory, Visuality, Effect, and Embodied Politics in the Americas. Regina Chen is part of one of my favorite organizations, one that has recognized how what we build with our hands, hearts, and minds has a tremendous power to transform society. With training in engineering and architecture from Princeton and a master's degree in urban planning from Harvard, she applied that learning when she began her work at Kigali, Rwanda with Mass Design Group. And I know she's going to share some of the work that she's been engaged with us today. Let me turn it over now to Dr. Murphy.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. I am really happy to be joining you, to be joining SAR, and of course, Estevan and Regina. I have long been interested in the relationship between place, identity, and memory, and how the stories we tell about ourselves and the places we live come into being, but also how they are reinforced and challenged, open to correction, and also how they have the potential to move, hopefully, toward visual and spatial narratives that are more honest and reflective of the people and the histories embedded in those same sites. On that note, Arizona, where I work and live part-time, is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, and the University of Arizona occupies the land of the Tohono O'odham Nation and the Yaqui tribe. I'm currently in Santa Cruz, California, where I grew up, which is the land of the Ohlone and the Costanoan tribes. These are important recognitions that are directly connected to some of the challenges and tensions related to visibility and the politics of belonging and recognition that I expect we'll discuss today. In recent years, as all of you know if you are in this webinar with us, monuments and the function and import of monumentality and practices of monumentalization have increasingly come under scrutiny. Statues, usually white male figures made famous for their role in a country's past, or infamous, depending on your perspective, have been painted over, chipped away at, dragged down from pedestals, hung, and dropped into the nearest river, including where many of you are in Santa Fe. So while discontent with the American monumental landscape is actually not a new phenomenon, the groundswell of pent-up rage and frustration with the seeming impunity of wealthy white men and the violent white supremacy sweeping the US is perhaps unlike anything this country has seen for decades. Recent years have been defined by the Black Lives Matter movement in response to police brutality and deeply violent systemic racism inflicted on Black communities, Indigenous rights movements to protect territories and stop asset stripping, the Me Too movement against sexual assault and sexual harassment, accused rapist Brett Kavanaugh's nomination hearing and subsequent confirmation of the Supreme Court, and the incessant cruelty and racism of Donald Trump's single-term presidency. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, the violent January 6th coup attempt, and the ongoing racial and gun violence have led many to argue that the US is fighting two pandemics simultaneously, the coronavirus and deeply entrenched racism and violence. So given these ongoing sociopolitical crises, it is not at all surprising that there has been fierce protest also surrounding monuments that are seen to celebrate heteropatriarchal white supremacy. Thus, the impassioned debates about what to do with many of these monuments dotting our shared cultural landscapes. Should they be left? Should they be removed and destroyed? Should they be rehomed elsewhere? Some final resting place for disgraced statues? Or should they be left but with additional monuments and signage added to provide further context? At the root of all of these debates is a fundamental inquiry about not just what monuments are, but more importantly, what monuments are intended to do for and within embodied politics. I actually think the question of what to do with existing monuments is really interesting, and I'm happy to talk more about it in our discussion. But ultimately, in the very short time we have to open today, what I want to propose is that much of how monuments are framed in public discourse is actually factually incorrect. And also that there are a lot of interesting and exciting possibilities for thinking about how to create and cultivate monumental practices moving forward. So I thought I would just share a few thoughts to that effect. First, there is no precise, comprehensive definition to what does and does not constitute a monument. But typically monuments are understood to be interventions in the built landscape that are intended to convey a sense of permanence and commemorate a certain person or event. So historically, the traditional function would be to establish codes of heroism, triumph, affirmation of a particular leader or state, regime, and to instruct on what should be remembered and how. And so in this sense, by sort of working to establish / guide the values of the present, they're also working to shape the future. So these monuments are typically statues, pillars, buildings, all monuments that operate within a particular monumental visual code, right? So the monument is tomb, the pyramid, the obelisk, the figure, the war memorial, the victory monument, and the triumphal arch. So the strong semiotic referentiality of these visual codes serves to communicate timeless permanence. This is aided by the materials that are used, usually stone or another seemingly durable permanent material. I say seemingly durable, of course, because I grew up in a land of earthquakes, so very little is actually permanent in the end. But we see this anyway across the United States in our monumental landscape. So second, the foundations of our US monumental landscape were laid in a very specific period of history, the post-Civil War period, in which statues were seen to play a critical role in forging nation states and national ideologies around masculinity and triumph. There was an obsession with monuments at this time. It was like, even in the literature from the time, it was described as a statue mania, in which people were obsessed with Americans' great men, usually white explorers, inventors, statesmen, and soldiers. Christopher Columbus was the most popular great man, though in the decades following the Civil War, countless Confederate monuments were built, from simple granite shafts commemorating common soldiers to towering bronze statues of Southern heroes like Robert E. Lee or Jefferson Davis. Thousands of war memorials were erected during this period, and they were intended to reify a national ideology of militarism and masculinity. And they really reflected turn-of-the-century anxieties about national unity, anxieties that were unleashed by the rapid advance of modernism, immigration, and mass culture. So by the 1880s, statue monuments had spread through cities and towns, honoring common soldiers, civil servants, and local politicians. And I think the thing that's a bit funny for us to think about now is that this was not met with approval, even at the time. There's this really funny quote from the Atlantic Monthly in 1879, where they say, quote, "People were blazing with ardor not yet spent to cover the land with monuments, set up statues to all of their perishable celebrities." So there's incredible criticism of statue mania. There was complaints of poor craftsmanship, indifferent placement, civic congestion, hyper-commercialism, and general public irrelevance. But this statue mania of the late 1800s and early 1900s laid a really heavy footprint. So it's ironic and actually kind of bizarre, actually, that many of the statues, heavily criticized and disliked even at the time, are the monuments whose fates are being debated today, often with arguments they must be preserved as rarefied vessels of historical importance, which in many cases they're not that. So I've written about this, and there's a lot more to be said here, but ultimately looking to the future, I want to argue that even in spite of this historical tradition of using monuments to reify illusions of white male power and nation building, monuments actually have quite a bit to offer us for a really important reason. Monuments are speech acts. They are public proclamations of certain narratives that are intended to simultaneously reify that narrative and lay claim to the space in which a monument has been placed. And so this is the irony of monuments. They're often backward facing. They serve as reminders of a past, but they can also play a critical role in opening dialogue, encouraging citizen participation, addressing longstanding erasures and silences, and igniting cultural reckoning with violent, painful pasts and their ongoing lived afterlives. And in this, monuments are future-facing. They're present serving as proclamations about the values and narratives that define a community's present and thus its future. Monuments matter precisely because they are symbolic, because they are celebratory, because they are visual speech acts about cultural values. And as a cultural practice, monumentalization thus has incredible value. It's incumbent upon cities and regions to more fully democratize the practice so that monuments do not represent only the wealthy elite, but rather celebrate the broader communities within which they reside. This also means we have to reorient how we conceive of monuments and the practice of monumentalization to focus less on antiquated signs and symbols and values, and more on monuments as speech acts with the potential for real effects in the present and future. In the time remaining, I thought I would briefly highlight a few exciting contemporary monumental practices that encourage audiences to reflect and ask ourselves, what do we need from our monumental landscape? What imaginings? What other ways of being together in community and place? How can we honor the richness of our history? How can our monuments tell the stories of our lives, our losses, our struggles, our hopes, and our commitments for different futures? And given our time constraints, I'm gonna go through them pretty quickly, but I also just want to mark that with sort of an eye to Regina going after me, I'm a huge fan of Mass Group's work. I'm talking about a different kind of work in order to sort of have a different representation, but I'm also really excited to talk about the stuff that they have done in our conversation. So the first one I want to look at is Shtotinema. Shtotinema is a really beautiful nomadic participatory monument to the Bosnian Srebrenica genocide that was made by Ida Sehovic. It began in 2006 and only came into being one day. But this one is landmarked. This is by Ada Pinkston. She's a Baltimore-based educator and activist. She began Landmarked in 2018. Landmark is a means of exploring the empty spaces left by the removal of Confederate monuments and practices of monumentalization more broadly. There are other examples that are similar to these kinds of monuments. This would be Kehinde Wiley's Rumors of War series, Onyedika Chuke's The Forever Museum Archive, Wangechi Mutu's The New Ones Will Free Us, Karen Olivier's The Battle is Joined, to name but a few. These are all monuments and monuments-based interventions that reckon with the violent values embedded in many historical monuments and monumental tropes, but they also underscore the dynamic future of monumentality and monumentalization. In and of itself, the practice of monumentalization is neither dead nor the problem. It is rather that our understandings and expectations of what monuments are and do require radical update. In the end, the US monumental landscape is a work in progress, as it has always been. The fierce debates about monuments are entirely in keeping with historical practice, if of a different tenor than in the past. And these debates are important. They are the sign that people are fighting for what they believe in and for the right to feel safe in and belong to and in shared public spaces and communities. Such conversations are how democracy is cultivated and maintained. Monuments give us incredible opportunity to determine and to proclaim our commitment to how we collectively work toward better futures and to determine what must finally become part of the past. So a few more stone men may end up rolled into rivers, others may be melted down and remade into new forms that serve as pedagogical bridges between what was and what we have committed to become. Still others may be rehomed in statue parks, cemeteries, and elsewhere, their relocation now an important part of their greater story. And new monuments and monuments-based interventions will emerge to both reify and usher in a new state of affairs. And finally, by way of closing, and I do want to thank the artists with whom I spoke with as part of this larger research project. Without their artistic practices and vision, and also their openness and generosity and sharing their work with me, none of this would have been possible. So thank you so much. I'll mute myself.
Thank you so much, Kaitlin. I have so much I want to engage with already. Regina, you're up.
Thank you again so much for the invitation. I'm also truly honored to be here with you all and Kaitlin. I also really appreciate the pairing of us two and being able to talk about our work together. I think we're able to show kind of a diversity of experiences and background here. So I'm going to just start with like a quick background about Mass Design Group as an introduction into kind of our values and pedagogy around how we think about our approach to the design and the design process. So Mass Design Group is a nonprofit design collective that was founded upon the belief that design is never neutral. And I think, you know, the world is very aware of a building and our space's ability to help us feel safe or help us kind of feel like we're not safe in our space, particularly since 2020 in light of the COVID pandemic. And so we were founded with the mission to research, build, and advocate for architecture that promotes justice and human dignity, that seeks to provide spaces of healing, that seeks to provide processes of healing. And another way that I like to talk about our work is that we seek to partner with mission-driven organizations to help them understand how we can amplify their mission through not only the design of the built environment, but the process of design of the built environment and the uncovering of truth and history through that engagement process. With that in mind, you know, Mass Design Group is made up of a multidisciplinary team because we know it's not just architecture itself. Sometimes it's the narrative around space and place and community. And so on our team, we're made up of of course, architects and landscape architects, as well as writers and filmmakers and storytellers and researchers, because we know it's not just about the design of one monument or one space or one memorial, but it's really about the narrative of our buildings and our places and our communities. And that's where architecture needs to sit, and that's where design can have the greatest impact. So we were founded about 15 years ago with the design and construction of the Batara District Hospital. And we were invited by the late Dr. Paul Farmer, who, from his experience in South Africa and in Haiti, was seeing hospital after hospital where patients were going to be healthier, to kind of convalesce and to receive treatment, but they're actually walking away with different strains of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. And so he challenged us with the question, what would it actually mean if we designed our healthcare facilities to be spaces of healing, to be spaces of infection control, where nosocomial diseases or transmissions within a building itself weren't happening? And so we worked to understand kind of where those transmissions were happening, where we could leverage the natural environment to bring in fresh air in places that may not have consistent access to electricity, to reduce actually the mortality and morbidity that we were seeing in healthcare spaces themselves. What we learned in Bureau, Rwanda was it wasn't just the design of the building that contributed to healing for Batara, for Rwanda, but it was also the processes by which we engaged the community. That it wasn't just physical or patient health or doctor and nurse health, but it was also community health that architecture had the potential to impact. That it was economic health, it was environmental health, there was opportunities for educational training. That architecture had the ability to make impacts in a number of different ways throughout the community if you were able to leverage both the design and the design process. About 10 or 15 years later, kind of with the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, or the Lynching Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama, our understanding of architecture's role in providing healing kind of was flipped on its head and continued to grow. That it wasn't just physical or economic or educational health, but it was also societal and cultural health and healing, but as well as like truth telling and reconciliation that needed to happen, and that the built environment had a role in understanding all these different aspects of what it meant to provide healing or to bring about healing in a community. And some of our other projects, I'm kind of going to go through just a few for the sake of background and to set up our conversation. This is an exhibition called The Writing on the Wall. That's a traveling exhibition. And this is when it was open on the High Line in New York. This was a project in partnership with Dr. Baz Dreisinger and the conceptual artist Hank Willis Thomas to bring to the fore that these were thousands of letters that Dr. Baz Dreisinger exchanged with individuals across the world who are being held in solitary confinement. This work was done as part of our Restorative Justice Design Lab at Mass Design Group, with really intention of challenging people walking on the High Line and living and visiting New York City every day with this question of whose stories are we telling, whose stories are being heard, and how can we elevate and amplify the stories of so many people who are being tortured and punished and held in places that totally lack dignity and humanity, and how can we bring those stories to the fold, and really using the space of the High Line in New York to ask that question and to challenge visitors to listen to stories that they may not have heard before, and really change their perception of what's going on with our incarceration system, specifically in the US, but also globally. And the Gun Violence Memorial Project is another project that this is pictured in Chicago, Illinois, that's currently open in Washington, DC at the National Building Museum. This was a project that was initiated at the opening of the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, when Pam Bosley and Annette Nance Holt came to Mass Design Group and said, thank you so much. This memorial is exactly what our country needs today. It opened in 2018. And they challenged us. The next thing that you need to work on is a memorial to victims of gun violence. And both of them shared their stories of their two sons that were taken due to gun violence. And Pamela said this line that has just stuck with us ever since, that she lost her son twice. Once when he was taken to gun violence, and once when he became a statistic, when he became a number, that his narrative was taken and changed because of who he was and where he lived. And so they challenged us to say, like, we need to make known on a national level the toll and the significance of gun violence. And you need to do that without losing the story of my son, without losing the story of Terrell. That a memorial to gun violence needs to cover both the breadth and depth of who was impacted by gun violence. And so we worked with them, as well as Hank Willis Thomas again, and the national organization Everytown for Gun Violence, to really understand what would it mean to design a memorial to gun violence, and how could we actually design a process of engagement that would contribute to that process of healing, that it didn't have to wait until the structure was completed, the design, the last nail was put in, but it was one that from day one that we could work with communities and listen to communities and travel along that process of healing together. And so what we designed together was a process by which we invited families and community members and individuals who've been impacted by gun violence to share with us their story, to contribute a remembrance object in honor of somebody that they loved, that told the story of who they were and what they loved about them, and that could serve as a living memorial of somebody that has been taken due to gun violence. Together, these remembrance objects fill 4 glass houses, and each glass house is made up of 7 bricks that hold each brick with a name, the date of birth, and the date of death of a family member and a loved one that's been taken due to gun violence. It holds their story, it holds who they are, and together these houses represent a space where we're able to come together and grieve the loss, but also a space where community members can gather together in action. Understanding from the community of survivors that being able to gather and protest and gather and fight for policy and gather in action is also part of their healing process. That they wanted to memorialize people that they love, but they also didn't want it to just stop there. It needed to be a memorial that was looking forward and created a space for them to keep advancing. And so the memorial, as it was open in Chicago and as it exists in DC today, is made up of 4 of these glass houses. Each house, as I said, holds 700 glass bricks, representing the number of people who are killed every week in the United States due to gun violence. So these 4 houses together represent a month of lives that have been taken. And together they create a space both inside the house and in the middle of the houses where community members are able to gather and hear stories and gather together in action. We were able to activate these spaces in both Chicago and moving forward in DC to bring together these community members. Pictured here is groups responding to how many people have either directly or know someone who's been impacted by gun violence, just really recognizing the massive toll that it has on our society. But also creating spaces to think about what's next. Why are we gathering together? What do we want? How can the memorial lead us to action and lead us to change? And we've also been able to see family members taking pilgrimages to take one last vacation with their loved member, with their loved ones or family members, and to be able to kind of also have the space to be together in family, to grieve and celebrate the lives of someone that they love. So those are just some project examples, just kind of as a background and kind of to give a bit of insight into how we think about our work. And so Estevan, I think I'm gonna pass it back to you, but thanks everybody for your time and looking forward to the discussion.
Regina, thank you. I mean, this work is obviously more important than ever, and with us in these past couple of weeks, especially with as much gun violence as we've continued to see. And this is the house that we have built in the United States, really. And it just made me think of that in terms of a metaphor. I have some questions, and we're gonna have a discussion first, and then we're gonna turn it over to the audience. I see that our audience, which is I think quite sizable, has many questions already. But what we are drawn to do this work. I don't believe in objectivity. We're drawn subjectively for different reasons. And I guess just I want to know at a very personal level what draws you into this work. Kaitlin, I'll ask the two of you, like why are you doing this? What is it about you personally that is drawn into this work? Kaitlin?
That's a good question. I think it's the kind of question you could answer in a couple of different ways, and probably all of them would be true, but they would give you a different understanding. I grew up in a family really dedicated to public service and to social justice work. And as a child, when I was younger, we lived in countries that were recovering from war in Central America. And I remember being so struck by people's ability to move on after just truly devastating loss. And so I have always been, I think, really fascinated and I want to say like impressed, I'm not sure that's quite the right word, but with human resiliency in the face of incredible trauma, and thinking about the ways in which politics play out in our personal lives, and our personal lives shape our politics, and thinking about ways that healing happens through spaces and through creative practice. And so I think because of my deep interest in politics, and then also growing up as an artist for much of my life, and then being endlessly sort of curious, if I were to pick one characteristic that's defined me through my entire life, it's like endless curiosity. And so I think those just kind of wove together to end up in a place where I am really fascinated by the stories that we tell about ourselves and how we tell them, and what we hope that telling does.
Beautiful. Thank you. Regina?
Estevan, is it okay if I cry on this?
I
don't.
Yes.
That's a great question. And, I think not to uncover kind of the deepest parts of my psyche, but, I think as like an Asian American woman growing up in the US, I've always personally felt like I didn't belong. Whether it was people asking me what my real name was, or constantly being in physical and emotional spaces that weren't designed for me, or that didn't understand what my background was or my experience or what I brought. And I think, when you think about physical space and design, I think my own career trajectory started in architecture and engineering and expanded to urban planning, like really recognizing how little space was designed for the communities that they were intended to serve. And so I think really at the core of it, for both me personally, kind of trying to create spaces of belonging where people feel safe to show up as they really are, as who they are, and understanding and recognizing and respecting and being able to tell the truth about history. But then also just having spaces that say, I see you, I know you, this is who we are, this is our collective memory. It's not just one strand of history or one story that's being told, it's your story, it's our story. And so I think that has always moved me, both from like my own personal experiences as well as the communities that I've both lived in and been invited as a visitor and a friend into, and consistently hearing that same thread of a narrative of existing in a country that we're not welcomed as we are, and not only not welcomed, but mistreated and marginalized. And so I think that our built environment is a literal physical representation of the political, the economic, the emotional, the social treatment of communities like mine, of many different, of each of our communities. And so I think, yeah, at the base, that's probably a core motivator for me in being in this work.
You're going to make us cry. Thank you. Thank you for both of you, what you do. Kaitlin, I've only started to read your work and I'm captivated by its breadth and depth. I didn't give myself enough lead time to order the book, but you live in Arizona, which is in close proximity to the US-Mexico border. And though I know you have thought and written about many borders globally, and art as resistance, I'd love to hear a little bit more about how art can be used to inform and catalyze public policy. You've spoken about politics very clearly, and I love that. And even now in what motivates some of your work. But I want to just get you to reflect a little bit about those two, the connection.
The connection between art and public policy?
Yeah.
It's a good question. I think it's a question that you can take from a couple of different perspectives, depending on who your audience is and what you're trying to accomplish, to be totally frank about that. I wrote an article last year that's about art and atrocity prevention that makes essentially an argument for funding the arts as part of recovery post-atrocity, and sort of goes through the risk factors for atrocity and the ways in which art tends to each of those. And so in terms of like making a concrete connection between violence and risk factors for more violence, upstream, midstream, downstream violence, art actually tends directly, sort of engages directly with each of them in different ways. So in terms of like making those arguments to people who may not necessarily be bought into the arts, I think there are ways to do that. But more broadly, I would say that art is essential to public politics, or public policy rather. And the reason for that is I think that sometimes there's a tendency to think of politics and to think of policy as abstract entities, and to lose sight of the fact that actually at the end of the day, they are both people and they are individuals, and they are individuals who are thinking, feeling, doing, acting, experiencing, working together, making choices that then impact other people. So when we talk about policy and politics, it's really easy to abstract them and then to feel overwhelmed and powerless. And I include myself in that even as I say that. Right now, the world feels like it's on fire and like there's very little we can do about it. And that's exhausting and it's terrifying. At the same time, however, we also know that the way that we create change is actually at the individual level and then it magnifying outward. I believe strongly that the arts are a way in which we have found as humans to think, to feel, to process, to express, to share, and also to impact, to change people's minds, to change how they think, they believe, they share. There are so many stories. I mean, I teach, and I often teach classes like human rights and documentary film, or what have you, various versions of that, monuments, performance, whatever it is I happen to be teaching. And I can't tell you how many times I hear a story of someone saying, this changed my life. Like, I didn't know humans could be that way. I didn't know that was a possibility for me. I didn't know that was a career I could have. I didn't know that was a career, I didn't know that there were people who felt the way that I feel, and knowing that makes me feel like it's okay to be who I am. All of that is enabled through the stories that are told through art. And because of that, art creates communities, art creates allegiances, art creates alliances that become power and that have influence. And so on a community level, you might be able to say on an individual level, art enables the processing of feelings, of affect, of hope, of trauma. That's important. I'm not trying to say one is more important than the other, but sort of to recognize a sense of scale, and that each point on that scale is important. Art matters on an individual level. You can make art that makes you feel better that no one else sees, and that is worthy of being made. You can make art that matters because people see it or because you make it together, and real effects are made through the act of making and processing or watching or experiencing. And art matters because of the ripple effect and the impact it can have on a broader scale. Shaping the way people think, shaping what is no longer acceptable. I mean, I wrote a couple of years ago about the function of photographs and shaping public opinion in the United States and globally. I mean, I think about some of the photos from the Vietnam War or from 9/11 of people jumping off of buildings so that they weren't burned alive, or that incredible, I think it's Kevin Carter's photograph of the child starving to death in the Sudan War with the vulture watching nearby. The photograph that won, it was the Pulitzer, and of course, the photographer committed suicide a couple of months later. It was a devastating thing. But there are these photographs that change public opinion, and when public opinion changes, politics follow, because politics follow the public. It's easy to think it's the other way around, and that's not true, actually. And so I would argue that art is one of the most powerful tools that we have at our disposal as humans. And the fact that people try to disempower it is precisely because it is so powerful.
That's great. Thank you. At one level, as I was listening to both of you talk and just knowing this dialogue, at one level, this is all about storytelling, right? Who gets to tell the stories, who doesn't get to tell the stories, concrete stories, counter stories. And your response now, Kaitlin, also reminds us that politics and policy is not abstract. There are people behind all of this, right? People making those decisions, whether it's inactive or actively trying to do that. But then there also are communities. You've both spoken about the community. What role do you think community plays in developing a process to create monuments and memorials? You've each spoken about it a little bit, but I'd love to hear from you. Gina?
Sure, yeah, and I'm also looking forward to hearing what Kaitlin has to say about it too, but I think community is so critical in understanding whose story should we be telling and who should we be memorializing and monumentalizing. I think community has to be involved now because we weren't for so many of these monuments that were put up, and Kaitlin talked about, just touched on how and why so many of these monuments were put up in different eras in the US in particular, with kind of like a political or a cultural agenda that stemmed from white men in power. And so I do think that community is critical in being involved, and really needs to be to kind of really upend the historic ways that monuments and people and narratives and stories got told, and then and also what that represented about our society in terms of who we are literally putting on a pedestal to look up to and telling their stories and representing to our communities and our children.
Kaitlin?
Sure. So tell me if I got your question. When I answer, tell me if you want me to revise my answer if I get it a little bit wrong. But it was the role of communities in monument making, or?
Yeah, let me revise it just a little bit. It is, that was that. But I mean, it's complicated, right? It's absolutely true what Regina was saying, that before, when those Confederate monuments were going up, that was, the community was not involved at all, right? There were individuals or individual groups making these decisions, or political bodies, and we knew what those political bodies, who they were, right, at those particular moments. And in some cases, many that continues to happen. But when you say, when you go into a community, and you've both given examples of how that happens successfully, but it's complicated and it's complex when you're working in community. Can you speak to that complexity?
Yeah, and the answer is yes, that it is complex and it is difficult. And I don't think that there's a right or a wrong answer, or actually just one answer, unfortunately. I think it's a little bit of like it's very context specific, and it usually takes time. Not always, sometimes it can be very quick, but it has to do with sort of dialogue and debate. It doesn't necessarily require consensus. That's very difficult with us humans, it turns out. And I think the other thing to remember actually is that there are a lot of different kinds of monuments and memorials to a lot of different things, right? And people. And so I think sometimes, as I just did when I talked about monuments, I focused on monuments that have been pretty contentious recently. I did not talk about all the ones that were all like, yeah, that's fine, we are not thinking about them at all, right? So I think when we talk about putting forth a monument, we would also want to ask ourselves, okay, well, first of all, actually, I can put up a monument in my yard by myself and not ask anybody, and I can make it to anything I want, right? I think it becomes a little bit trickier if we're talking about monuments that are intended to speak for and to the public and are placed in public spaces, because when they're placed in public spaces, they lay claim to those spaces and they lay claim to those narratives. And that's where we see a lot of the tensions that come up when perhaps a monument is put up unilaterally without what we might call due process or community engagement. And also because the reality is that communities don't always agree. And so at a basic level, to give a general answer to your question, I would say it comes down to community engagement. It comes down to starting the process right and working through it, as frustrating as it sometimes is. And this is everything from surveys and town halls and discussions and processes where people say, what are your memories of a space? Let's just imagine you're putting together a new monument for the first time. I was just consulting on something like this recently. So let's say that a community wants to put together a new monument in a particular space. Okay, well, probably in the beginning, you're going to want to sit down and talk to people about, like, what is your relationship to this space? What do you remember about it? What matters to you the most? What are the different stories that are already embedded in this place? And then what do we do with those and how do we move forward? So it's a longer process, but to move forward eventually toward deciding what to do in a space, that's a really different question than, say, here's this thing that someone else put up without talking to anybody or put up a long time ago and not a lot. Now people really, it's become very contentious. We're not sure what to do about it. That is a process that's moving in a different direction. But I would say it's engagement and process and dialogue, and that's tough.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. If you could identify something worth remembering, some type of creative memorial, an event, past, present, a site, a person, group of people, or story, help us imagine what that looks like. I wanted to even give you an example of like a thing, but like, what would you, if you could identify something, how would you do that? What would that look like? Invite us into that. Regina?
I think that's a great question. I'm trying not to answer the Gun Violence Memorial Project again, but I think that project, I think, also comes back to your last question about how is the community involved and how are you didn't ask this question exactly, but like, how is so many times community engagement today is a means to an end, a way to get to one answer, a way to check the box, a way to kind of move forward with the project. And I do think that what Kaitlin was talking about and shifts that we see in the field is community engagement as a space to open up dialogue, that we're not necessarily just trying to get at one answer, but we're trying to create a process where discussion and dialogue can happen. You don't have to walk away with one answer. And so for me, the Gun Violence Memorial Project is an opportunity to tell the story that bridges a political divide, that is able to hopefully depolarize the conversation and really focus in on story and a recognition that we're all impacted by gun violence, and that we need a different approach to understanding how we address this epidemic. And another, I think, story that comes to mind that I'm also seeing is a little bit reflected in some of the questions that we're getting is an organization called the Echo Project in Warren, South Carolina, where there's this historic segregated theater that shut down, was purchased by a member of the KKK and turned into what he called the redneck shop, and sold Confederate and KKK memorabilia, and was open from 1996 to 2012. So very recent in community memory. I think one question is, how do we tell the story of what had happened and who it was affecting? And also Reverend Kennedy and Reagan Freeman and people who were fighting against both the segregated theater as well as kind of the goals of the redneck shop, to tell the story of like local and everyday heroism without elevating and celebrating the history of racism and racial terror, but also not only elevating an individual, but kind of this collective fight against racism, this collective desire for both truth telling and reconciliation. And I think that space is going to look different than any other memorial or monument or space that we've seen before, because it has to be, it can't be a bronze statue, it can't be an ivory tower. It's got to be a place that process can happen, that community is invited in, that we're living out the history that we've seen, that we're also trying to move away from. And so we're working on that project. Maybe next time I come back, I can show some images of what it'll look like. But I think it's really exciting. It's a challenge to think about, how do we tell this story without elevating those racist ideals, but also create a space that's living, that's adapting, that continues to be part of the story moving forward.
Fascinating. We look forward to that. Kaitlin, I want to talk all day, but we have an audience. Kaitlin, but do you want to answer that?
Sure. I guess I'll just give two quick examples, and then I'll throw something that's going to seem out of left field, but that I've been thinking about a lot lately.
Okay.
The first, I just want to say that Mass Group's National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Alabama is, I think, one of the most beautiful memorial spaces in the United States. I love it, and I'm so impressed, and would actually love to just talk about that memorial all day long. So that was one of the most successful ones that I have seen in a very long time. I was in South Africa a couple of weeks ago, and I went to the District 6 Museum in Cape Town. And that was stunning and really changed my understanding of what a memorial space can / in some places should be. It's a place, a neighborhood that was torn to the ground during apartheid, and people were dislocated, forcibly relocated elsewhere. It's a devastating story. I will not take all of our time telling the story of this neighborhood, but there's a map that's all over the floor of the museum, and people have come in and they have written on the map where their house used to be. Mm-hmm. And survivors come and they hang out in this space and they drink coffee and they talk story. And it's a real gathering space, as much as it is very much a memorial to what was lost through the memorabilia in this space. And so that was really quite moving. And it's a very alive space, which I really appreciated. What I have been thinking a lot about lately that I would love to be a part of, if anyone who's listening is doing this, call me. I have been really interested in doing a monument or a memorial to the environment, actually. Not the environment is obviously still with us, but there is an environmental genocide that is happening all around us, in which not only are we at fault, but we are implicated in the collapse. And I don't quite know if it's because it's too big that people can't wrap their heads around it, or sometimes is a bit distant. But I think we need to do something to really recognize that loss and to raise awareness around it and sort of change the dialogue around climate change and fires and floods and everything. And so I am really interested in thinking through that. I don't know what it would look like or where we would do it, but I'm interested.
Kaitlin, you just opened up. I'm so interested in this, and I may call you. I have an idea, and it ties to something that Regina was talking about, the invitation by Paul Farmer to actually think about healing and how monuments and monumentalization and memory work so powerfully in community when you're working towards a concerted value like that. And for me, for many years, I've thought about aspen trees as I call them my 3 R's. They're rooted, and that it's one root system, as we know. So it speaks about that connection. It's resilience. They come up years after a fire has ravaged a mountain. And that speaks to why a fire has ravaged a mountain, to your point about a monument to environment. And then resilience, roots, and radiance. Again, reflecting that in our community, it just I love that idea. So I'm going to call you with an idea around aspen trees. Michael, should we open it up? Or we're going to talk here all day?
Yeah, it's time for that. A lot of questions. I don't think we're going to get to all of them. The Q&A opened with more of a dialogue between several people, Maureen, Randy Barra, and Brian Martin, about early incidents in which statues were torn down. And they mentioned the destruction of the statue of George III at the reading of the Declaration of Independence. And Kaitlin talked about this period of creating monuments. Have there been other periods when monuments were destroyed or abandoned and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I'm just skimming in the chat. It looks like Randy answered, and yes, Randy is correct. I think he writes the equestrian statue of King George III. Yep, executed, absolutely. I mean, they're often in regime change, you see statues toppled. The really famous ones in the Middle East as well, more recently that we've seen.
Mm-hmm. But then there are follow-up questions about who authorizes groups to tear statues down. This is more of a contemporary issue. So we talked about community consultation, and yet some of the incidents that we've seen over the last few years, it isn't clear exactly whether the destruction of that statue reflects the sentiment of the community or whether it's just a sort of self-appointed group who want to bring it down. How do you deal with that? How do you even make those decisions in an ethical and politically defensible way? Nobody wants to take this hot potato.
Regina, I just want to monopolize. Regina, do you want to?
No, I was looking at you. I feel like this is a little bit more your expertise too.
Oh, why don't I think this is obviously a very specific question about the very specific time that we are living, where this is being debated, and in some ways it's also similar to when we look back to the toppling of statues after the Civil War or after the War for Independence or Wars for Independence in the Middle East, where statues are toppled. They're not necessarily toppled after a long committee has taken 6 months to review the facts and to debate and to gather and then to reschedule because there are scheduling conflicts. Sometimes these things happen more quickly and they can be divisive. We are living through a reckoning right now where people are dealing with legacies of structural racism that have been devastating to this country. And so it is true that not everybody will feel the same way about that or will be interested in moving with the same urgency to take down symbols of white supremacy. Mm-hmm. I think ideally it should be a community decision. I think sometimes communities exist in smaller community and it's not necessarily to say that there's consensus. So I would say the putting up and the taking down or the moving in a best case scenario should be something that is talked about and decided upon and acted out. As a community, we've seen a lot of examples of that, especially throughout the East. I'm pointing to the East. But I know that has not always been the case. Yeah, and these are the times we are living.
Yeah, I would just add, I think it's interesting. The question maybe is a little bit more about the consequences of the individual or the group that is taking it down. And I feel like another interesting question is also like, does it deserve to go back up? Or, it's both a question about who is doing the taking down and what's happening, but also what, if there is nothing there, what fills that place, and what's the processes by which we make those decisions. I think both parts of that are equally important questions to consider and to bring to the community dialogue.
But there's a related question from Martin, and this comes up a lot, and we've heard this discussion before, which is, well, why not leave the statue in place and then use it as a focus for discussions, mutually edifying discussions about what this means, why it's hurtful, why it's there in the first place, that sort of thing. Has that actually been deployed or in certain situations? We certainly went through a period where tearing them down seemed to be the first approach, rather than keeping them or relocating them to a more appropriate place where they could be a focus or a stimulus for discussion.
Yeah, so the Southern Poverty Law Center has a really great study that they've done where they show all of the monuments to the Confederacy in the South, and then also the ones that have been taken down and what's happened with them. And there's not, I think, a single answer to like what is right or what is wrong. I personally think that the argument that leaving up a statue for its educational content is pretty flawed. I think if we're talking about community education, the practice of talking through why the statue was put up in the first place, when it was put up, whether or not it still reflects the community's values, whether or not it should be taken down, and what should be put in its stead that would represent the community and what to do with that statue is probably much more educational than an additional plaque. But you would have to rely on community-based processes to make that decision on a case-by-case basis with statues. I don't think that there's any one answer there.
There's I know you didn't want to get into the obelisk question, Estevan, but there is one from Lynn Withy, and it kind of speaks to Kaitlin's point, which is that for people not from Santa Fe, there was an obelisk, it's parts of which are still in place in the Central Plaza of Santa Fe. And it was torn down by, again, a self-appointed group. But the interesting thing about an obelisk is that it doesn't mean anything in itself. And in fact, there had been some offensive, a plaque that had referred to the soldiers, who lost in the fight against savage Indians and so on. But that had been modified and edited decades ago. So the question is, an obelisk itself, I'll bet that 95% of the people who come to Santa Fe never knew what it stood for. It was just this object in the middle of the city. And it always seemed to me that the semiotics of it could be redefined, through a public discussion, but that hasn't happened to date. I don't know. You didn't really want to go there, Estevan, I guess, but if you had a thought on that, I'd welcome it.
Well, I think Lynn's question was whether I was involved in that process, and I'm not. I'm not involved in that process necessarily, but I think this is something that Kaitlin just spoke to in her last response that is applicable even in this particular case, right? So even before it was removed, I wrote an article that I'll put into the chat on Medium that was reflecting on this. I mean, even though the word itself, savage, was removed in the 70s, the harm remained and people knew it, right? That's how those and it really speaks to how, to Kaitlin's point, even once you remove it, the harm still remains until it's fully addressed. I mean, that monument was never meant from the very beginning to focus on that particular Indian Wars. It was meant to focus on a Union battle against the Confederacy, right? But then legislators sort of intervened because the architects were taking a little bit too long and needed more money. And they went back to the legislature. The legislature opened it up and actually complicated the issue, right? Because it was a present issue. And in that article, I reflected on the fact that it's ironic that half of those legislators were themselves holding indigenous enslaved people. So here, it's a very complicated situation, but it doesn't change what Kaitlin was saying in terms of really working to address in a community-based process. But you need leadership and you need vision. And we have not had that here, unfortunately, to really address that. But to Regina's point, I mean, ultimately, this community, like any community, needs healing around that. I've offered some thoughts toward that, and I said I didn't want to speak about it, but there you go. But there are a lot more questions in there, Michael.
There are, and here's one that is sort of interests me from Kim Strauss, who says, remember when the Vietnam Memorial was controversial initially and now seems to have been universally embraced. So it seems to me that sometimes you can't always predict, at one moment, a monument could be powerful and accepted by the community. And obviously 50 years later, it could be seen in a completely different light. So should we give up on permanent memorials and just go to have them, I don't know, reviewed every 10 years for their significance? But how do you deal with a situation like that?
Michael, do you want to pick an easy question to answer?
Well,
I do think, something our research team at Mass has been trying to understand is like, how do we evaluate the success of architecture? And recognizing, I think LEED has a certain way of evaluating good or bad. But one thing that is hard for us to do is understand that, monuments are 50 to 100 plus year structures, and we can't judge them by a single moment of time. And so really kind of trying to shift the way that we think about the value of design and architecture to one that understands the lifespan of a project or a building and how it's responding to or driving culture and narrative. And I think it really takes a change in how we think about success of any built structure to really understand and an ability to look at it over time. I think is critical to just even our own merits of placing a label on something as this was good or this was bad.
Kaitlin, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question, and it's also probably worth the trouble with all of this is that there's never any one answer, and the answer is usually pretty complicated, and so it's sort of hard to speak in generalizations about it. But I think, for example, part of the conflict around the Vietnam Memorial, if I recall, is that at the time people didn't feel like it didn't reflect the symbolism that people wanted. People wanted
that's right.
The visual tropes I was just talking about like the guy on the horse, and that it was too quiet and too soft, too hidden of a memorial. It didn't match the semiotic codes people associate with war triumph, and she did it on purpose. It was a really different kind of memorial than people were expecting at the time. And of course, then they added the additional one to sort of compensate, like right next to it, which is a shame. But, I think there are always going to be questions about the built landscape. The built landscape is not meant to be permanent, but meant to be with us for a time. And so if we eventually get to a place where we recognize that there are symbols in our common spaces that are violent and harmful, and they celebrate deeply violent racist tropes that continue to negatively impact our societies and potentially prohibit us from moving forward in more peaceful ways. I think that's something that's really important to take seriously. And I don't think that that's something that will be relevant to the vast majority of our built landscape, but I think the places and spaces in our built landscape for which that is important do need to be looked at.
Well, we're reaching the 75-minute mark, so maybe it's time to any closing thoughts that you'd care to share before we sign off. It's obviously a complex issue. I don't know, I'm an optimist. I think we've made some progress, and certainly the work that Regina and her colleagues are doing is important and could really make a difference. Estevan, you're never lacking for wisdom.
Thank you, Michael. I'm really speaking about wisdom, the wisdom that Kaitlin and Regina have both shared today about the work that inspires them, that they're working on, that brings them to the work is actually, I'm humbled by it. And I just want to take a moment to, as we have only a moment, to thank the two of you for that work. You're raising our consciousness, and you're doing it in a way, as you said earlier, Regina, it's storytellers, whether they're urban planners or they're writers or poets or visual artists, they're all engaged in this process. And for many years, all that broad spectrum of individuals were not engaged. And I really appreciate that we're living in very troublesome times, but we always have. But we're navigating through it in very different ways and providing these counter stories. And again, just to thank the two of you and the work that you're doing. Please keep doing it. Thank you. And Michael, thank you for providing the platform for this type of work to move forward.
It's a pleasure and an honor. I won't add anything to your comments because they're so elegant and powerful. So I'll simply thank all three of you for joining us for this. And it's a powerful note on which to end our series. And I look forward to following your work in the future. Thank you.